by the law. The dust is still settling, but as we heard during the February hearing, it's logical to expect that issues of fraud, waste, and abuse will start popping up now that the money is beginning to flow. I'll get that. I hate it when Janikowski calls him directly. So far, award recipients have spent nearly 5% of the funds. Approximately a dozen recipients have decided not to pursue their projects and have returned their awards worth $70 million. Some have cited the economy and their inability to fulfill their obligations if they move forward. With 95% of the funding yet to be dispersed, the question is how many programs will run into the hiccups down the road. As stewards of the taxpayers' money, I know we all want to prevent misspent funds and fraud. So when the inspectors general, comptroller general, or administrators identify issues, it's important they are able to quickly determine whether there's a problem and take appropriate action. It's also important that Congress be apprised of such developments in a timely fashion and be made aware of the decisions the administrators make. While we're not seeking to change the programs, we will continue to ask the important questions, including what criteria are used to determine when it's time to terminate an award. Now, out of fairness to the applicants who are denied stimulus money, the successful applicants that are abiding by the terms of their awards, and most importantly, the American taxpayers, if an award recipient does not comply with the terms of the award, it should be terminated. I believe the legislation we're considering accomplishes these goals. Working with the minority and stakeholders, we've improved the language and addressed a number of concerns. I'm sure if it needs further refinement, and we are aware of some of those suggestions, we plan to work with the minority and all of you to get it right and fix those things as we get up to the full committee. This legislation clarifies the administrator's responsibility to deobligate funds when there's cause to terminate the award. Additionally, it institutes a new reporting requirement that will keep Congress apprised of relevant developments regarding awards. I thank Mr. Bass for taking leadership on this effort of this modest but necessary legislation. I know this is not earth-shattering, okay? We're going to move on to earth-shattering in the future. This is a housekeeping effort we're trying to get done. And on that note, I would also like to suggest that given the schedule today and a number of votes that are going to occur on the floor, we probably only have about 45 minutes to work through this. My goal would be, with the support of the committee, subcommittee, is to move through the testimony as rapidly as possible, and if we can, get into the markup on the subcommittee, recognizing I think there are only a few minor things we need to work out between here and full, which we could do, so that we could pass this on to the full committee. With that, I would recognize my friend, the ranking member from California, Ms. Eshoo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to you, to all the members of the committee, and to our guests. I want to extend a warm welcome to Assistant Secretary Strickling and to Administrator Edelstein, whom we've had the pleasure of working together for a number of years, where he served with distinction at the FCC. I'm going to ask that my
without objection,
magnificent opening statement be placed in the record in the interest of time. And we want to work with you, Mr. Chairman, because I think that there are what I raised earlier about tweaking the legislation, because there's a sensitivity about the OIG and DOJ. We do not want to, pour cold water
Correct.
over cases that have the potential for being prosecuted relative to a fraud or abuse. I just want to say that this will be the second time that I'm voting on the same thing. And so you're right. This is not earth-shattering. In fact, I really do, with all due respect, think it's a waste of time. Effective oversight is very important in terms of the program, and I welcome that. So with that, I'm going to place my comments in the record, and also ask that the letter from the NATOA, the National Association of Telecommunications Officers and Advisors, be placed in the record. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else want to make opening comments? Mr. Waxman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. It's an important area for us to look at, and I want to welcome Assistant Secretary Strickling and Administrator Edelstein back to the committee. We appreciate the extraordinary efforts that you and your colleagues have put into establishing these programs and look forward to your testimony. When Congress passed the Landmark Recovery Act, we built oversight into the very structure of these programs. We knew it was imperative to provide the Departments of Commerce and Ag with the tools necessary to conduct vigorous oversight of approximately $7 billion in broadband spending. And Commerce Department Inspector General was allocated $16 million, Ag Department Inspector General $22.5 million to oversee and audit it. With billions of dollars invested in hundreds of broadband projects throughout the nation, Congress must not skimp on oversight funding. The agencies tell us they have adequate resources to conduct effective oversight. However, Congress still needs to be vigilant, and if unanticipated oversight challenges emerge, we have to be ready to ensure that agencies and their independent IGs have adequate resources to oversee these projects. It's inevitable in a program of this size and scope that some of the projects funded will not work out as anticipated. In fact, a handful of grant recipients have already withdrawn from the programs. This money was promptly deposited in the U.S. Treasury, as it should be. Today we'll consider a legislative proposal that directs NTIA and RUS to do what they already are doing, returning these deobligated funds to the Treasury. I don't understand why we are enacting this duplicative legislation, but I'm not opposed to the legislation. What I like most about it before us is not the substance, which I think is probably unnecessary, but the process. Chairman Walden has reached out to the Democrats to reach a bipartisan consensus on the bill. Republican staff has included Democratic staff in discussions about this measure and has sought our input and suggestions. And I appreciate this effort and hope it is a harbinger of how we'll approach future proposals. As we consider this bill, we must be careful not to adopt legislation that inadvertently complicates the ability of the agencies to oversee these programs effectively, and make sure that we don't encourage defunding projects without good cause, especially now that obligated money has been translated into real projects with real jobs in every state. I want to yield the balance of my time to Mr. Doyle from Pennsylvania, and I'm looking forward to the testimony.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you, Mr. Waxman, for yielding. Happy April Fool's Day to you both. I agree with the need for today's hearing, and I believe we should continue our oversight of the parts of the Recovery Act that will help countless people throughout the country get online. But that being said, remember the TV show Seinfeld? If Seinfeld was a show about nothing, today's markup is about very little. While the Senate's about to mark up spectrum legislation, we're marking up a bill that's already law. I don't oppose the bill, but it seems to me that it's the legislative version of the J. Peterman catalog. It's pages of language about things we don't really need. After all, the administration is already returning canceled grants to the Treasury for deficit reduction. So we really don't need this bill, but as Jerry would say, not that there's anything wrong with that. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle, and Mr. Chairman, we look forward to working with you, even though we hear some criticism. But I think that it's important that we continue to see where we can be together.
Gentleman returns the balance of his time, and we love you too. So let's.
Let's not get carried away.
Okay. All right, I withdraw that statement. Now we'd like to turn to Mr. Strickling. Before I do that, though, for our members who just came in, just so you kind of know the lay of the land here, we probably only have until about 11:15, and then we're going to have a series of votes. I'd prefer to go ahead and see if we can't get in and out of the markup before we have to go vote. Otherwise, we may have to come back after the votes, which could be in the afternoon. So with that, Mr. Strickling, thank you for being here. Thanks for your testimony.
Well, thank you, Chairman Walden. And Ranking Member Eshoo, Vice Chairman Terry, members of the subcommittee, thanks to all of you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of NTIA concerning the administration of our grant programs. I also would like to take this opportunity.
Could you pull that microphone a little bit closer, sir?
Yes, sir.
We're the Communications Committee and Technology.
Very good. I also want to take this opportunity to acknowledge and commend our Secretary, Secretary Locke, who, as you know, hopefully will be moving on to China, but he's played a very important role in the oversight of this program. And I want to recognize my colleague, Administrator Adelstein. I guess this sparks our 2011 broadband tour. It was quite a successful tour back in 2010 as we went to, I think, to 7 different committees to testify about this program. I welcome the opportunity to comment on the draft legislation that is the topic of today's hearing. Before I speak to the draft bill, I'd like to provide a quick update on the status of our programs. Since we completed our grant awards on time last September, NTI has been focused on providing vigorous oversight and high-quality technical assistance to grantees to ensure that they complete their projects on schedule, on budget, and that they deliver the promised benefits to the communities that they serve. And I'm pleased to report that our projects have already made significant progress in achieving those goals. In the last quarter of 2010, our grant recipients reported funding approximately 1,000 jobs. To date, they've installed more than 4,000 computers for public use. They've provided over 150,000 hours of broadband training to date to over 65,000 people. In Michigan, North Carolina, Maine, and elsewhere, our infrastructure projects have broken ground and have begun building fiber and wireless facilities. Consistent with our philosophy to focus on middle-mile projects to prime the pump for private investment to serve homes and businesses, I'm also quite pleased to report that our grantees have already entered into about 90 interconnection agreements which will allow the existing incumbents and new entrants to serve last-mile customers. I would also like to let you know that on October 17th of this year, we, in collaboration with the FCC, unveiled the National Broadband Map. This is the first public, searchable, nationwide map of consumer broadnet internet availability in the United States. The map is the most granular and transparent data set of broadband availability that has ever been published. And while we can draw many conclusions from the map, there are 2 I want to emphasize this morning. First, that our data shows that 5 to 10% of Americans do not have access to a level of broadband service necessary to perform a basic set of internet applications as defined by the FCC. And second, the map proves what we knew during our grant review process, which is that anchor institutions are greatly underserved across our country. 2/3 of the schools that were surveyed subscribed to services slower than 25 megabits per second, and 96% of libraries that were surveyed subscribe at speeds slower than 25 megabits per second. Now, protecting the federal funds we are spending is of paramount importance to us. As the members of the subcommittee are well aware, achieving these objectives is challenging and requires us to perform diligent oversight and provide technical assistance to our awardees. Our large and complex grant program continues to raise novel issues, some of which have potential to impact the progress of our projects. And let me just give you one example. Before our infrastructure grantees can begin construction, most of them have to complete and submit an environmental and historic preservation study in compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, and the Endangered Species Act. These processes can take significant time and resources, and we have worked very hard to find win-win solutions to enable our projects to move forward in full compliance with these important laws. And we are committed to working with our grantees to complete these environmental requirements as rapidly, as thoroughly as possible. To solve these and other issues, yet maintain the rigorous implementation schedule demanded of these projects, we have put into action a program-wide oversight strategy to mitigate waste, fraud, and abuse, to ensure compliance with award conditions, and to monitor the progress of each project toward its timely completion. The technical assistance that we have conducted to date includes holding multi-day grantee conferences on key implementation topics. We've hosted over 40 webinars and drop-in conference calls to provide guidance on key topics, and by the end of June, we will have performed site inspections for 72 of our projects, representing about half of the total grant pool. The goal of our program is to identify issues early in the process and to resolve them as promptly as we can. Earlier this week, I notified Congress that we have had 2 grantees terminate their awards recently. And while I'm disappointed that these 2 projects, one in Indiana, the other in Wisconsin, will not be built, I do believe that our diligent oversight led to the termination of these projects early on with only a minimal expenditure of federal taxpayer dollars. As required by law, we have already returned the full $14 million of the Indiana grant to the Treasury, and we will promptly return nearly all of the $23 million Wisconsin grant upon completion of an accounting with the state. So given that experience, let me turn to the draft legislation. We support the ultimate goals of the bill, which are to protect against waste, fraud, and abuse, and to ensure that unused or reclaimed funds are promptly returned to the Treasury. And while we do not believe that the additional steps are needed to ensure adequate protection of taxpayer funds, and I think our action in response to the Wisconsin and Indiana terminations prove that, we have no objection if Congress believes that the reporting requirements contained in the bill, in addition to the other mechanisms already in place, would further protect taxpayers. We do have some concerns, however, about the specific wording of the requirement to deobligate and return funds to the Treasury, and we look forward to working with the subcommittee to clarify this language. And let me just allow me to close with some comments about our relationship with the Inspector General. I'm extremely grateful for the ongoing efforts of the IG in helping to oversee our grant programs. Throughout the life of the program, the IG has identified additional steps we can take to oversee our programs more effectively, and we have worked hard to implement their recommendations as thoroughly as possible. Now that we are in the oversight phase of our program, we have had discussions with our IG as to how we should handle complaints we receive about our projects. We haven't received many, and in many respects, the complaints simply reflect policy disagreements and do not raise serious allegations of waste, fraud, and abuse. But nonetheless, the Inspector General has told me we can do better, particularly in developing a more structured process to review these complaints. And to that end, we will be working with the IG to improve our performance in this area, just as we have with every other recommendation the IG has made to us over the course of the program. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Trickling. And if you can keep the committee, I'm sure we all have interest in that part of the process, too, as this rolls out. So your suggestions to the IG and back and forth, if you keep us in that loop, that would be helpful as well.
Absolutely.
Mr. Adelstein, thank you for being here. We're delighted to have you here, and we look forward to the summary of your testimony as well, sir.
Well, thank you, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to be here in front of you to talk about the Broadband Initiatives Program we call BIP and legislation to amend the Recovery Act. I'm delighted to be here again with my friend Larry Strickling, who we've done many times before, including before this subcommittee. Our agencies work very closely together to fulfill the President's vision of getting broadband out to every corner of this nation, and the Assistant Secretary has been an invaluable partner throughout the process. Our Secretary, Tom Vilsack, has made broadband a pillar of his strategy to revitalize rural economies. And the direct benefits of broadband in the rural economy are immense. USDA's Economic Research Service has studied the effects of broadband in rural communities and concluded, based on their statistical analysis, that employment growth was higher and non-farm private earnings greater in counties with a longer history of broadband availability. The Recovery Act provided RUS with the unique opportunity to jumpstart the rural economy, investing more than $3.5 billion in loans and grants to expand broadband networks in the hardest-to-serve rural parts of the United States. Demand for broadband financing under the Recovery Act was really tremendous. RUS received over 2,000 applications totaling $28 billion. We were able to make only 320 awards for that $3.5 billion, only 16% of the applications received. This amazing response, and of course the NTIA's map that the Assistant Secretary referred to, I think demonstrate the huge demand that remains in rural America for improved broadband service. In September 2010, the RUS completed the awards phase of this program. Our selection process was extremely rigorous. Of the $3.5 billion in loans and grants, $3.25 billion went to 285 last-mile projects. $173 million were for middle-mile projects. We did $3.4 million for 19 regional technical assistance projects, and finally $100 million went to satellite service to premises that were otherwise unserved by any of the other grants under this program. Now, these investments are going to make a big difference. They connect nearly 7 million Americans, 360,000 businesses, and more than 30,000 critical community institutions to new or improved broadband service. They span over 300,000 square miles, touch 31 tribal lands, serve 125 persistent poverty counties, about a third of the persistent poverty counties in the United States, and they'll create more than 25,000 immediate and direct jobs for workers. Once built, though, these networks will provide the platform for economic growth and job creation for years to come. These projects are really extraordinary. I know in the interest of time, I had a lot of great examples here. I'll just give one example that's particularly important because it's in an important district in Oregon, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs Reservation in Oregon, scheduled to break ground this month, just in a couple of weeks. It'll bring broadband to the entire 1,000-square-mile reservation, connecting 223 community institutions, including government agencies and emergency facilities, 775 households and 22 businesses. It'll be transformative for the Warm Springs Reservation. Our excitement for these projects is matched by our commitment to execute our duties very prudently and to be very careful with taxpayer dollars. RUS shares the goals of your legislation, Mr. Chairman, to return unused or reclaimed funds to the U.S. Treasury and to aggressively combat waste, fraud, and abuse. The bill's purpose is entirely consistent with the standard procedures already in place for RUS programs, including BIP. The RUS has some concerns with the draft, and we look forward to working with the subcommittee to address them, and we'd be happy to provide any drafting assistance as needed if you should request it. To ensure our continued success and prudent portfolio management with regard to the Recovery Act, RUS has done a lot of work. We've held compliance workshops, we've visited every award recipient, and we've required quarterly reports and annual CPA audits. We have our own field accountants, and we've sent our field accountants to each and every one of these recipients before any money is spent to ensure that their accounting system complies with all of our requirements and that it's set up and something we can really audit and be on top of. Now, the USDA Inspector General, we work closely with them and we appreciate their good work. I understand that in the last month they were here before this committee raising concerns about the broadband loan program administered under a previous administration, under a previous statute, and under previous regulation. And I share these concerns. To be clear, none of the issues raised by the IG pertain to the Recovery Act broadband program or the Obama administration's conduct of the RUS broadband loan program. The broadband loan program was actually suspended during the Recovery Act to allow the agency to address all of the concerns that were raised by the IG and to implement statutory changes that were made in 2008 and to integrate the lessons of the Recovery Act into these new rules. On March 14th, just last month, the RUS issued new broadband regulations that opened the program for applications for the first time under this administration. The new regulation and other actions taken by the RUS have satisfactorily addressed all of the issues raised by the IG. So I'm thrilled to report to the subcommittee that last week, the Inspector General concluded and closed completely the RUS broadband loan audit. So the book is shut on that audit. The new broadband loan program increases efficiencies, targets limited resources, and builds on the momentum created by the Recovery Act BIP program to fill the gaps in rural broadband access that were identified in NTIA's map. So it's an honor to work with you, with our Inspector General, and with our other federal partners, including NTIA, to make affordable broadband service widely available throughout rural America. Your continued support and guidance is deeply appreciated. Appreciate the opportunity to testify and look forward to any questions you may have.
Sir, I appreciate your testimony of both the gentlemen, and I want to congratulate you on fulfilling the recommendations of that audit. I don't care who's in charge where. I'm glad you got it done because that one goes back to 2005, I think. And so thank you for doing that. Again, for our committee members, given the schedule we face, I'm going to try and limit my questions. I think I'm going to just go with one. If we could get into the markup, but I don't want to rush anybody. If we could get into the markup before they call votes on the floor, that would solve having to come back after the vote, say at 2 o'clock or something, 2:30. So, Mr. Strickling, doesn't Section 6001 I-4 of the ARRA state you may deobligate funds? Actually, I can tell you it does.
You're correct.
Yeah, it may, not shall, and that's really the issue. It isn't whether you deposit them in the Treasury. It's you are, and not you personally. It could be somebody down the road. Different has this flexibility whether you will or won't deobligate. This legislation says you shall, and while you've said, and I trust that you will deobligate funds in such cases as fraud, waste, and insufficient performance, doesn't this change provide you with that added legal protection in that it reduces the ability of a failing awardee to quibble over what would otherwise be your discretionary decision?
I can't debate the change in the words. What I can tell you is under Department of Commerce guidance, it's less discretionary in the sense that we are directed under DOC provisions that we will take these actions. In any case, again, we don't have any issues with your legislating in this area, but I don't expect it to change our day-to-day practice.
Yeah, but this does put certainty in the statute, as opposed because the discretion, the guidance out of the department could change in another administration or even in this one, could it not?
I would agree with that.
Yeah, so we're just trying to give some certainty there. I'll yield now to anyone else on our side that may want to ask a question. Mr. Bass?
Mr. Chairman, I just have two very quick questions. Secretary Strickland, what's the current requirement to report to Congress regarding awards that show material noncompliance, and do you think that the passage of this legislation would increase the transparency of the Recovery Act?
I can't speak to there being I can't identify a particular legislative directive to us to do that, but I think as reflected in the letter I sent earlier this week, it's certainly our practice to do so.
You mentioned, both of you mentioned the number of awards that you've made, amount of money spent to date, the amount that I think you identified 3 that have been discontinued. Have you learned anything from these returned awards that will be beneficial to you in your oversight on the existing projects?
We've actually had 2 projects that went to award, and we actually went through the process, started the process with the applicant, and then they have since terminated. There is a 3rd award that the applicant never actually accepted the award, a small award up in Minnesota to Leech Lake for about $1.7 million. But of the 2 projects, I think each of them is presented a unique set of circumstances. In Indiana, quite frankly, it was a situation where other things were going on economically in the state. It was a project designed to serve schools. Indiana is going through a school consolidation, and our grantee and along with our folks at NTIA realized that their business case was deteriorating as a result of this other set of governmental actions, and the project just didn't seem viable any longer. And so the applicant decided to withdraw because they couldn't see that they would have an ongoing project after the completion of the grant period. We've been very focused on giving awards to projects that we think are sustainable and will continue on even after the grant period. In the Indiana case, it was one of, I think, again, through our oversight and discussions with the applicant, we learned early on that the project really wasn't viable in the way we thought it was when we had reviewed it during the review process. Wisconsin, again, totally separate set of facts there that I'd be happy to discuss with you separately.
Okay. Mr. Adelstein, Administrator Adelstein, do you have any comments on that?
If there's anything we draw from that, it's that we need to very aggressively work with and oversee every aspect of each one of our awardees' programs and the progress they're making on the projects. With each of those 10 that we decided mutually not to move forward on, there was a lot of issues, and we worked hand in hand with them. We sent our field accountants to visit them. We sent our general field representatives to visit them. I personally worked with a number of them. We met with them. We determined whether or not changes they were proposing were consistent with their original application. In some cases they weren't, and we weren't able to work it out. And so we went our separate ways. Not one dime of taxpayer money was spent in any of those projects. So we were able to save the taxpayer by upfront making sure that they understood what we expected and that they were meeting all of the concerns that we had. And if they weren't, we didn't hesitate to rescind the projects.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Any other members on our side have questions they feel compelled to ask? If not, I'll yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you to both of you for not only being here today, but for the work that you've done, which really speaks for itself. I'm going to go as quickly as possible because we're under time constraints here. My main question is, how does the bill that's going to be marked up, that you have obviously reviewed, how does it differ in any way from your existing mandate or practice to terminate grant or loan awards for cause? Is the legislative language different from current practices relative to the deobligation of funds? When an award is deobligated, how does your agency work with the awardee to account for the funds? I think that you've touched on that. And how long does it take on average for a deobligated fund to be returned to the U.S. Treasury, which you already have a responsibility to do? And the last thing I want to touch on, which is what both the majority and the minority need to work through, is this issue of the IG, the OIG, and where they may identify potential fraud. And the language of the bill, I mean, we don't want to throw ice water on a case that has real potential to it. That's not the intent of any member on the committee. So if you want to comment on that, it is something that we need to work out, and I think that's the intention from both sides of the aisle.
Yes, ma'am.
In other words, what we're taking up today, how different is it from what we've already passed?
I think on the first part of your question related to our practices with respect to de-obligating dollars and what happens to the dollars and that, I don't think it really changes the existing law. In terms of how long that takes, in the case of the Indiana project, since there had been no federal expenditures of federal dollars, we were able to very quickly return that full amount. In the case of Wisconsin, we will do an accounting with the state because we think they have spent a nominal amount of dollars. We think it's less than $100,000 of allowable costs, which they would be allowed to recover, and then the remainder will go to the Treasury. But we do have to carry out that accounting.
So the legislation doesn't change any of that?
Fundamentally, no. On the issue of, I mean, the second part of the legislation does impose some time limits on us in terms of taking actions and reporting to Congress. And I know, I think Administrator Adelstein may have had a little more experience with how the implications of that.
From what to what? What is the time frame on it?
The time frame is, as the Chairman knows, that 30 days we have to, after we are given any information that pertains to potential misuse of funds, to make a determination as to whether to terminate the project or not, and then we're given 3 days subsequent to report to Congress what our determination was, which is a new requirement. As the Secretary said, all the other requirements are basically consistent with existing law.
And what's the nexus between that and this issue of a possible fraud and the effect that it would have on that potential case?
Well,
Is there a nexus between the two?
There could be in some cases. In the case of serious fraud, which of course this legislation is designed to combat, RUS is generally given an indication by OIG. We get a confidential little folder that says confidential, do not report, and generally the OIG requests us not to take action to rescind a loan or grant if they refer it to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution. So we are asked basically to stay out of the way of a criminal prosecution. Under this requirement, however, we would be required, we'd be at a loss because on the one hand we're being told not to do it, and there's potential obstruction of justice if we do. On the other hand,
Chairman, I think this is the area
That's the part we're going to work out.
That
yes.
we need to work
on.
on.
Would the gentlewoman yield to me for just a
I'd be glad to.
Because I want to just clarify something Mr. Adelstein said. You said if you got any information, you would have to notify us. And actually, I think if you look at the language in the bill, it's such information pertains to material non-compliance. That's different than just saying any information.
Yeah,
we tried to set a fairly high standard.
I did say that information pertaining to misuse of funds, but you're exactly right. That's what the legislation says, and it would have to be significant information.
Yeah, it's not just information.
So to your question, I mean, if there was a serious one, these are the most serious cases where they actually would be referred to DOJ for prosecution. We would be sort of in a conflict between the requirement of this law.
Well, we need to repair
we'll work that out.
We're going to work that out. But I appreciate this being raised because I think it's important, and I think that my time is up. Mr. Chairman, thank you again, gentlemen. I think that you've confirmed what we already know and have voted on. But thank you. I do think that the oversight of the committee is what's really key here. Thank you.
I thank the gentlewoman, and I would just say that's why we're doing the hearing today, is to flesh out these sorts of issues and get it right. Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Strickling, Mr. Adelstein, welcome. Thanks for your good work. At our last hearing, many of my Republican colleagues expressed a belief that overbuilding is a persistent and ongoing problem with these BTOP and BIP awards. And now that you're finally both here to represent your respective agencies, would you once and for all dispel these concerns?
Sure. I do think it's a misconception with our program in particular, since we focused on middle mile projects, which are open network projects and available to anybody to take advantage of, including the incumbents as well as new entrants. And as I pointed out in my opening remarks, we've already seen 90 interconnection agreements that have been executed between our infrastructure grant recipients and carriers who want to take advantage of these facilities to improve the level of service that they're offering to their end user customers. So in that light, what we see our role as doing is priming the pump. We are putting these middle mile facilities out there through these organizations like Merit in Michigan and MCNC in North Carolina that are going to be able to provide much greater middle mile capacity throughout their states of Michigan and North Carolina, just to give two examples. And then other parties, including incumbents like AT&T in Michigan and North Carolina, can actually lease capacity on those systems to improve the service that they offer to their end user customers. So what we did in evaluating our projects was to ensure that we would be bringing substantial benefits to the area in which the projects would be built, and we think our projects passed that test.
Thank you. Mr. Adelstein.
And we made a major effort in both rounds of funding to prioritize the most remote rural areas. In fact, we gave extra points, priority for going to rural areas. We gave extra points for the number of customers that were totally unserved, extra points for being the most remote, and eligibility standards, and trying to get people 50 miles away from an urban area, which was actually too extreme for some. So we ended up really making every effort I think we could to avoid overlap, to make sure that there was service to those who didn't have it. And in fact, we did get service out to the most rural areas, and we're going to serve many millions of customers that don't have access to broadband today.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Recognize gentlewoman from California. Just know we've got about 5 minutes before we go vote. Otherwise, we'll have to come back after votes.
I'll keep that in mind. I want to thank both of you for being here, and I applaud your efforts in administering the BTOP and BIP process. I believe Americans will have greater access to broadband because of these programs, particularly in my home state of California. With that said, the GAO report noted that the uncertainty of continued funding for oversight presents a risk that both NTIA and RUS will have insufficient staff and resources to actively monitor BTOP and BIP-funded projects. I have a question for both of you. Do both of you believe you have sufficient funding to devote the resources necessary to oversee compliance?
As of now, yes, and I want to thank the leadership of this committee for its help on a bipartisan basis to ensuring that we got the resources we needed in this fiscal year to provide appropriate oversight. But at the level we are currently funded at in the existing CR, assuming that continues through the rest of this fiscal year, we are in fine shape. And again, it's through the efforts of the leadership of this committee that we got to that point, and I want to thank everyone for that.
Our U.S. requested no additional funds in order to oversee this program, so we're basically dealing with it out of our existing budget, which was already very tight. So the full president's budget really is required in order for us to do, I think, the level of oversight that we need to do.
So what you're saying is that the budget currently is fine with you, but we don't anticipate, if you don't anticipate any cuts in the budget moving forward.
That's right.
Okay, fine. And that's all my question. Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize the gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for Mr. Adelstein, and I'll be happy to submit it. But I want to refer to the letter that you wrote the chairman regarding the recipients of RUS loans using USF money to make payments on those loans. And, Mr. Chairman, I would love for us to have a copy of that letter for the record, the letter you sent to the FCC chairman. Yeah. And then my question to you specifically about this, some of these loans are for 30 years, and does that mean that we shouldn't reform USF until that point in time, and are we really advocating the use of a ratepayer subsidy to pay off a government subsidy? And in light of your letter and your conversation in that letter, those would be the two questions. We'll submit these, and then I would ask for it to be included in the record. Yield back.
Without objection. Anyone else seeking recognition? If not, okay, if you want to, yes.
I'll just ask one.
Gentlelady from Virgin Islands. Right.
Thank you. And the bill calls for termination for insufficient performance. And while I'm sure some fall in that category, may need termination, we're trying to expand to places that are rural and don't have a lot of experience. And don't you think that maybe some of those should get technical assistance and support rather than just be terminated? That's my question. And I just wanted to say that I have evidence of really tight oversight in a letter to my government that I received a copy of. Thanks.
I just very briefly, I think in terms of insufficient performance, from our perspective, we do intend to provide technical assistance where we can to work with our grantees to help them over the bumps that they may run into. I think an example of insufficient performance could be where the entire project management staff resigns and leaves a program, and there doesn't seem to be a plan in place to bring leadership to the project. In that kind of situation, we'd take a hard look at it and wonder whether it's worth continuing on.
And we perform similarly. We make every effort to work with our rural awardees because some of them are really struggling sometimes. And each one of the 10 we tried to work with to save the ones we could. Sometimes they couldn't be done, but we will give them every opportunity to comply and to make it work.
I recognize time constraints, so I have some questions. I'd just like to place them in the record. And
Absolutely.
Writing.
Yes, all members have that privilege to submit questions for the record. Thank you, and I appreciate your courtesy in trying to help us move this along. With that, the hearing is adjourned. And now I ask unanimous consent that we move into the markup without objection. The committee is reconvened to conduct the markup. Every member has an opportunity to issue an opening statement in a markup. I would suggest they will all be made part of the record, as will mine, given that we are expecting votes on the floor soon. So with that, the chair calls up the discussion draft. I'll let our counsel get there and ask the clerk to report.
Discussion draft HR blank to return unused and reclaimed funds.
Without objection, the first reading of the discussion draft is dispensed with, and the discussion draft will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there any amendments to the discussion draft, recognizing that we are going to work together to resolve these very valid issues that have come forth? Seeing no amendments. Is there any discussion on the discussion draft? Seeing no discussion on the discussion. The question now occurs on favorably reporting the discussion draft. All those in favor say aye. 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 Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the draft is reported. With that, I want to thank you for your cooperation with this hearing, and know that moving forward, and the discussion draft is agreed to, and the draft is ordered favorably reported. The chair thanks all members and staff. Before we adjourn, know that going forward, we are going to have a very rigorous schedule on Spectrum and other issues. Our hearing will be April 12th, the first one on Spectrum, and we look forward to working on a number of issues to deal with communications. With that, the subcommittee stands adjourned.